This is David Satin, Director of the Colloquium on the History of Psychiatry and Medicine. The Colloquium has been offered since 1989 through the Harvard Medical School, McLean Hospital Department of Postgraduate and Continuing Education, and the County Library's Center for the History of Medicine. It offers people working at their clinical, research, or other occupations an opportunity to step back and see their working lives in the context of past and the future. It could be argued that it is only in such a historical context that our activities and life as a whole has meaning. And it could be argued that workers in the field make unique contributions to history as well as other research. Wilfred Bloomberg wrote, "When a profession inherits or gains in technical knowledge becomes more valuable and even more effective when it is understood and evaluated in historic perspective." Let me invite the attendees to ask questions or add comments at the end of the discussion, at the end of the lecture. Do so by clicking on chat at the bottom of your screen and writing your comments, and Diana Satin will pick them up and relay them to us all for discussion. Today's presentation is Elizabeth Blackwell, first female MD, an extraordinary personality in American medicine, presented by Dr. B. Dale Magee. We are in an era of heightened awareness of equality and recognition and opportunity for various groups in our society. In particular, women, remember, a majority gender population, have been assigned particular roles in society and faced resistance in other roles. Their experiences, struggles, and routes to achievement have been documented and analyzed. Dr. Magee tells us of an outstanding example in the field of medicine. B. Dale Magee is a retired associate professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. He was chair of both the Garland and Estes lecture committees at the Boston Medical Library and is a past president of the Massachusetts Medical Society. He was curator of the Worcester District Medical Society, a member of the History Committee of the Massachusetts Medical Society, and is a collector of antique medical books and instruments, mostly in obstetrics and gynecology. He found the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology Mentor of the Year for Massachusetts in obstetrics and gynecology, and has written many articles, presentations, and made organizational contributions. Dr. Magee, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much for running the Colloquium these many years. Let me get my screen up for you and get the show on the road. Here we go. Now, the origin of this talk is a little bit serendipitous. I am a graduate of the Upstate Medical School in Syracuse, New York. And we take Elizabeth Blackwell as our own. As you will find out if you don't know already, she graduated in 1849 from the Geneva Medical College in Geneva, New York, 50 miles west of Syracuse. And Elizabeth Blackwell probably never set foot in the Syracuse University Medical School, but the two institutions merged with Geneva Medical School, moving to Syracuse in 1874, and they immediately took credit for graduating the first woman physician in the country. In fact, the first 2 years of my medical school, I lived on Elizabeth Blackwell Street. I've walked by her portrait so many times, and I probably knew just the most superficial amount about her. I knew that she was the first woman MD in the country. I'd heard the anecdotes about how the faculty of Geneva Medical School asked for the approval of the students before she was admitted, and heard how that may have reflected a bit of cowardice on their part. I have some other thoughts on that I'll get to later. That was about it. And years go by. I'm curator of the Worcester Medical Society, and I'm deaccessioning some books, and I happen upon a 1970s edition of pioneering work in opening the medical profession to women, the originally printed in 1890s autobiography of Elizabeth Blackwell. And so with that familiarity, I thought, well, I'll give it a read and see how it looks. I found it to be a remarkably accessible book. 19th century literature often is a little difficult to decipher. The vocabulary is different, the syntax is different. Not the case with this biography, and if anybody is interested, it's actually available online, and it's very readable. The other positive thing about it is that Elizabeth Blackwell had copious letters and notes and everything from her life. And so when she talks about something that she did in the 1840s, she's not in the 1890s remembering it, but rather she's quoting herself directly. And so it gives you a remarkable, you are there kind of perspective on this. So I finished the book, and I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine, John Baines, who runs a travel agency out of London that has a niche in medical history tours. And he was trying to find ways to remain connected to his clientele during the lockdown from COVID. This is about a year or so ago. And so hearing this, he was actually producing some videos to run for his clientele, as I say, to maintain his contact. And he challenged me to come up with a brief video on Elizabeth Blackwell. About a year ago, I did. It's posted to YouTube, and this is how I'm going to open this talk. We're going to go to this next. It's about 15 minutes long, and essentially give you an overview of Elizabeth Blackwell, which I think will fill in the blanks with regard to her incredible achievements. Then we're going to back up a little bit, sort of highlight her times a little bit and her personality, and then challenge you to share with me your perspectives regarding that as well as her achievements. So there we are, and we'll move ahead to the video now, and then go from there. So here we go. If you've heard the name Elizabeth Blackwell, you undoubtedly know that she was the first woman to achieve an MD degree in the United States. If that were her only breakthrough, she would deserve a prominent place in the history of medicine and the history of women's rights. But I've got news for you. When she was awarded that degree from Geneva Medical College in 1849, she was just getting warmed up. There's more, a lot more. Let's get started. Elizabeth Blackwell was born in 1821 in Bristol, England. She was the third daughter in a family of 9 children. They were religious. They were abolitionists. The children were educated at home by a governess, and her father owned a sugar refining business. Interestingly, in a move to express support of the abolitionist movement, the children gave up eating sugar, the product of slavery. When Elizabeth was 11, the family sailed for America and settled first in New York and then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, in pursuit of business opportunities. Within months of arriving in Ohio, her father died, leaving the once comfortable middle-class family penniless. The girls began taking in students, and the older boys took jobs at the courthouse. A friend, who was dying of uterine cancer, told Elizabeth that her suffering with her illness would have been much more bearable had her physician been a woman, and encouraged Elizabeth to become a doctor. Elizabeth, saying that she was repulsed by everything connected with the body, and saying that she could not bear the sight of a medical book, initially said that this was out of the question. But she saw herself as needing to champion a bigger cause and to provide a barrier between herself and an ordinary married life, which she did not feel suited to. She eventually decided that entering the medical profession would be that cause. This was in 1845. Medicine at that time was not the selective or prestigious profession that it is today. Most doctors did not have an MD degree in the United States. Most did apprenticeships, and some just hung out their shingle. Farmers sent their sons to medical school if they were no good around the farm. But these were not the standards that Elizabeth saw as necessary. She was not only going to enter the profession, she was going to elevate it. Her approach, which stood her in good stead for her lifetime, was to meet with friends and friends of friends who could help her and build connections. She won over even the skeptical by her drive and intelligence, but most ended up telling her that her quest was impossible. She was undeterred. In fact, she said that their verdict was an encouragement. This moral fight possessed an immense attraction for her. Indeed, at the time, the only woman referred to as a female physician was an abortionist in New York City. This repulsed her Victorian sensibilities and filled her with determination. Boarding first with a doctor in Asheville, North Carolina, and later with one in Charleston, South Carolina, she taught in schools that they ran, earned money for medical school, and was taught anatomy and physiology by the sympathetic doctors. At the time, Philadelphia was the center of medicine in the United States. She moved there in 1847 and boarded with a physician who was encouraging to her. She attended anatomy lectures, but was not able to gain admission to any of the 4 Philadelphia schools. She did, however, expand her list of contacts. Advice she received ranged from going to Paris, where medicine was taught in public forum, to disguising herself as a man to gain admission to local schools. But this was, in her words, a moral crusade, and must be pursued in the light of day. After being turned down by all schools in Philadelphia and in New York City, she obtained a list of schools in all northern states and applied to a dozen. The authorities at Geneva Medical College, reluctant to reject her based only on her gender, put it to the students to vote on her admission. The students were a rollicking bunch. Classes often so loud that the professor could not be heard, and neighbors complaining repeatedly of the boisterous noise and behavior. They, thinking that this might be a joke, voted her in. Within 2 days of receiving her acceptance letter, she arrived in Geneva. She had secured a room at a boarding house and was in class. Picture, if you will, a small riot taking place in a lecture hall. The door opening and a petite Victorian woman walking determinedly to a seat at the front, sitting down and carefully putting her hat under her chair, all the time ignoring the howls and pieces of paper drifting her way. The room grew silent. Order was restored. Nothing was going to shift her focus. Her notes were meticulous. Her performance was exemplary. A professor who sought to exclude her from a class, revealing a particularly delicate bit of anatomy, got a note from her explaining how important it was for him to ensure that all his students were knowledgeable. She would never want him to shirk his duties. She was admitted to the class. After spending a summer gaining clinical experience in Philadelphia at the Blackwell almshouse, assigned to the women's syphilis ward, she returned to Geneva to complete her studies. Ironically, and perhaps revealing of her Victorian sensibilities, she later noted that it was not until 1869 that her mind comprehended the activity that led to the syphilis of her patients. Back in Geneva, She readied for graduation in January of 1849. She refused to participate in a procession through town to the church where the graduation was held, since she felt that it would not be ladylike. Last to receive her diploma, she was declared first in her class. Done, right? Mission accomplished? Not quite. By her standards, a medical degree was not enough to ready her for practice, and she began a period of further clinical study. She initially returned to Philadelphia for more lectures, but felt the need to learn what England and Europe had to offer, and departed for England shortly afterward. She was greeted in England as a physician and treated to access to clinics and operating rooms. Indeed, after witnessing an amputation without anesthesia, this person who had previously said that everything connected with the body was repulsive, now determined to become the first woman surgeon. After an initial stint in England, she departed for France, then a center of medicine in the world. Her greeting there was quite a contrast from England. Doctors refused to accept her credentials, and she was told that she must begin training at the maternity hospital, where she could train as a midwife. Midwives at that time were otherwise uneducated and at the bottom of the medical totem pole. If that one was offered, that's what she would take. She spent several months there, confined to the hospital property. At the maternity, while irrigating the eye of an infected infant, she splashed water in her eye and became infected herself. Out of concern, and perhaps out of guilt, she was showered with the best medical care that Paris could provide. This included cauterizing her eyelids, leeches to the temple, opium to the forehead, cold compresses, ointment of belladonna, purgatives, foot baths, black mustard plasters, hourly irrigations. She remained in bed for 3 weeks, but emerged blind in one eye. Her response? Fate has certainly given me a blow, but I am up again, strong, hopeful, and eager to work. However, when it sank in that she could not do surgical work or read, what followed were 6 months of mental suffering. She had to abandon her plans to become a surgeon. Interestingly, in 1850, she received communication regarding the Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her response may surprise some today. She said, "I cannot sympathize with an anti-man movement. I've had too much kindness, aid, and just recognition from men. I think that the true end of freedom may be gained another way. The great object of education has nothing to do with women's rights or men's rights, but with the development of the human soul and body." In 1853, she returned to the U.S. and settled in New York City. Care in those days could take place in doctors' offices, homes, or home visits. For the poor, there were dispensaries for outpatient care and infirmaries, which were the hospitals of the time. The local medical establishment wanted nothing to do with her. When she applied for privileges at the women's department of a large dispensary, she was turned down and told that if she wanted to work in a dispensary, she would have to start her own. A similar fate awaited her when she applied to the infirmaries. While local medical schools slowly started admitting women, her view, having actually attended some of the teaching sessions to assess the quality, was that they were not admitting qualified students and they were not giving them adequate training. This was at a time when there were no state licensing boards, no prerequisites for medical school. Indeed, Harvard Medical School gave oral exams to get by the problem of illiteracy among its students. And postgraduate training was an option that most did not take advantage of. Elizabeth began seeing patients, gradually located physicians that would consult on her patients, and established a dispensary for women and children. From there, she incorporated, established a board of directors with prominent citizens, and then expanded to become the New York Infirmary and College for Women. By combining the infirmary with the medical school, she anticipated by decades the Johns Hopkins model of associating a medical school with a hospital. And by requiring rigorous courses prior to admission to her medical school, she was assuring that women who received degrees were more than qualified. In 1854, her sister, Emily, had graduated from medical college in Cleveland, becoming the third woman to earn an MD in the United States, and was studying in England, Scotland, and Paris, preparing to join her sister in practice. While awaiting her sister's return, Elizabeth was joined by a Polish midwife, Maria Zakrzewska, who was interested in becoming a doctor. Elizabeth dispatched her to Ohio for formal medical training before having her come back to join her at the infirmary. While in England, Elizabeth had formed a strong relationship with Florence Nightingale and came to appreciate the importance of the sanitary movement. She incorporated these principles into the care she delivered. Indeed, she hired Dr. Rebecca Cole, the second female African-American doctor in the United States, to make house calls among the tenements in New York City and teach sanitary practice. Thus, she established both a dispensary and an infirmary for women as well as a women's medical school and elevated the standards for all. But she wasn't done. Back to England in 1858, where she decided to settle, she sensed that there was progress to be made in the medical education of women. While she was registered as a physician in the medical register, which was another first, she was limited in that the medical schools would not admit her for further study. She mentored Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who did gain admission and was to become the first woman to earn an MD in England, and who then went on to start the first women's medical school as well as a hospital devoted to women, the London School of Medicine for Women at the Royal Free Hospital. Another collaborator, Sophia Jex Blake, a graduate of Elizabeth's New York City Medical School, also went on to found a women's medical school in Edinburgh. Towards the latter part of her career, she was sidelined by biliary colic that forced her to leave practice and convalesce. So what are we to make of all of this? Her accomplishments were so numerous. She not only set the precedent for women getting a medical degree, but she raised the standard. She saw problems and took the initiative, but always in a personal, bottom-up manner. To her, the letter of introduction and personal relationships were paramount. She made inroads one step and one person at a time. She was smart, curious, and of independent mind. Although she determined to enter medicine as a traditionalist, this did not stop her from attending and keeping an open mind to the many of alternatives that were out there. She also was frank in her skepticism of the value of much that was practiced in her day, and vowed to apply data collection and analysis to her own cases. She had numerous friends and maintained strong relationships, including having many male supporters. Indeed, her breakthroughs were due to her ability to work with men. She did not make enemies, but rather she found ways to go around those who stood in her way, and she never thought of giving up. As unique as she was a woman of her times and had an incredible support and connections. Her sister was the third MD in the United States. Her sister-in-law was the first female minister in the United States. Her brother, Henry, helped to found the American Women's Suffrage Association and the Republican Party. And his wife, Lucy Stone, was a leader in the women's rights movement in the United States. She was close friends with Harriet Beecher Stowe in Cincinnati, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, a breakthrough book in the abolitionist movement. Still, these were difficult years. She noted that ill-natured gossip and insolent anonymous letters took their toll. She noted, "These malicious stories are painful to me, for I am a woman as well as a physician, and both natures are wounded by these falsehoods. But, and get this, I'm glad that I, and not another, have to bear this pioneer work. A work of the ages cannot be hindered by individual feeling. 100 years hence, women will not be what they are now." Elizabeth Blackwell died on Tuesday, May 31st, 1910, at the age of 89, at her home in Hastings, England, and is buried in Kilmun, Scotland, a place where she loved to spend holidays. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about Elizabeth and add some context here. As I mentioned earlier, this was done about a year ago and posted at that time. Elizabeth Blackwell's 200th birthday was February 3rd of 2021. And anticipating that, author Janice Naimura came out with what I think is an extraordinary book called The Doctor's Blackwell, which is a biography of not only Elizabeth but Emily, her sister, and the remarkable lives that they both led. A very frank book, tremendous detail, easy to read. I highly recommend it. And in there, I when it came out, I read it. I listened to a bunch of author interviews, and in reading it, my sense was that Janice Naimura wanted to not only tell the positive aspects, but kind of uncover some of the aspects that might be a little bit negative. In all of the author interviews that I watched, no one took the bait, and they basically just went over the things that pretty much I went over with you already with the video. But let's build some context here, and let's use some of the additional information that came through the Doctor's Blackwell and see where that takes us. So if we look at just the times of Elizabeth Blackwell, there was a lot going on in America in that period in which she was most active in this country, 1840 to 1870. There were, and probably continue to this day, issues regarding states' power versus federal power, the idea of a centralized power being something that many felt was a threat, and indeed was largely behind the American Revolution. And underneath this comes the relationship between the individual and government. Individuals, not unusual for them to feel that the further away the power is from government, the less say they will have, the more compromises there will be. These kind of questions come up. And there's unrest regarding slavery, which just didn't pop up just before the Civil War, but was just in there constantly since the founding of this country. And there was a lot of unrest regarding that. And as I'd mentioned, the Blackwell family was very strict abolitionists. The roles of women also popped into this and were front burner issues, issues regarding property rights and issues regarding education, as Elizabeth Blackwell noted, and suffrage were really being tossed about. And if we look at Cincinnati, which is where she moved in 1838, kind of an interesting town because there were a lot of intellectuals there. There was, this is where the Beechers and the Stows were. But Cincinnati was a border town, and Ohio was a free state, and Kentucky, right next door, a slave state. And so around the time she moved into Cincinnati, there were a lot of people who were supporting the abolitionist movement, and there were also race riots going on because economically there was a depression at that time, and a lot of blacks seeking freedom were shifting up to Cincinnati. And so you've got this interesting conflict that was occurring right where she was growing up. So turbulent times is basically the big measure here, and also the idea of the rights of the individual, the roles of women, and certainly the rights of blacks as well. If we look at medicine in the 1800s, I covered this in the video a bit, but I just want to highlight a little bit more that most doctors, about 40% or so, went to medical school, most did not. And the heroic medicine that was popular at that time, you could probably dial back 100 years and see very little in the way of innovation that had occurred in medicine. And what was being done had more to do with authority than it had to do with actual scientific basis. And many people, with good reason, saw no connection between medicine and science. People, there are a number of examples where people called the doctor, were bled or purged or whatever, ended up in worse shape or even dead. And so people were ignorant to this. They wanted to be doctored. They wanted to be cared for when they were ill, but they sure didn't want to sign up for something that was going to make them worse. And so there was an active market in those times, a lot of interest in other things that may or may not help them, but may be less likely to hurt them. So homeopathy from Germany, the minuscule doses of what harmed you to build up your resistance. Thomsonianism coming down from northern New England with steam baths and laxatives and purgatives, basically cleaning you out. And mesmerism, an 18th century product of Germany, but still gaining in some popularity in America during the 19th century. Water cures, other things. These were what was being practiced at that time, in addition to the so-called traditional medicine. But after 1840, we really enter into a second era, an era in which medicine starts to look like the medicine we know now. And I'm a big advocate of the idea that discoveries and ideas not only have an individual who may be credited with the discovery, but also a time that supports it, a moment in which the people are ready to receive the information. And so if we look at the 1840s, within a few years of each other, Semmelweis in Vienna, Holmes in Boston, come up with the cause of childbed fever being some particle, some substance that the caregiver is bringing with them to the woman in labor, as opposed to some sort of miasma that's rising from the ground and in the ether. So these two people in two different techniques came to about the same conclusion at about the same time. Also mid-1840s, Morton in Boston, Wells in Hartford, Long in Georgia, Simpson in Edinburgh, all discovered that chemicals could be used to induce a painless state. And anesthesia was born, and as a result, the capacity of surgery to help people just took right off. In the 1850s, Florence Nightingale and John Snow, both in England, using very different approaches, basically uncovered the value of hygiene in promoting health. And they also, along the way, essentially invented epidemiology and put on the chart those sorts of measures as part of the routine. Between 1850 and 1870, Pasteur, Koch, Lister essentially invented the field of infectious disease and Lister techniques to mitigate the risk of infection associated with surgery. And also, along with the women's movement in the 1840s to 1870s, the issue of admitting women to medical school came up. And Geneva, obviously, was the first to graduate a female physician, but Elizabeth Blackwell actually had been admitted to or accepted at a school in Vermont as well. She chose Geneva, but she actually had a choice. And Elizabeth Blackwell maintained that to maintain the dignity of women, the value of their credential, that they should go to the same school that men went, they should have the same standards that men had, and the like. She later changed her mind. Female medical colleges popped up first in Boston and then Philadelphia, and took off. And so the issue of do they go to their own medical school or are they mainstreamed comes up. And I throw Harvard Medical School into the mix here because there is an instance of roughly 1850 when Oliver Wendell Holmes was dean of the medical school, and with the approval of faculty, he allowed 3 blacks and 1 woman to take classes at the medical school. As soon as the students got wind of this, they went on strike. And as a result of this, the invitation was rescinded, and that remains very controversial to this day. But, you know, in this comes a couple of thoughts, one of which is that medical schools in those days didn't have an endowment. They didn't have other sources of funding. They were utterly dependent on their tuition, and if the student said, we're not going to pay you, you're out of business. And so their options under these circumstances were very limited, and that is something that's important to understand as well. Now, in that context, when we look back at Geneva and see that the faculty approved of Elizabeth Blackwell's admission, but that they asked the students, maybe they were kind of in touch with what could possibly happen, since the failure to ask the students led to a very different outcome at Harvard. So I subsequently kind of moderated my point of view with regard to them asking the permission of the students before admitting Elizabeth Blackwell. And then the other piece is with all of these discoveries, there was something to know in medicine. There was a difference between a good doctor and a bad doctor. There was an importance in improving education. And so just the quality of education really started to change from the 1860s on. So again, this is the atmosphere in which Elizabeth Blackwell is functioning. And if we look at the Blackwell family, the father died when the kids were young. It was right after they moved to Cincinnati, so they're relocating. He, it sounds like, had a flare of what might have been malaria that he caught while in New York, and died. And when that happened, they found that he had essentially no savings. They went from being a middle-class family to essentially threatened with poverty. And the mother, Hannah, had her hands full with 9 kids, and really wasn't in a position to support the family. So in this context, these siblings bound together and formed a relationship that may have been significantly tighter and more long-lasting than you would see in a typical sibling relationship. The 3 oldest children, Anna, the oldest, was 22 when the father died. Elizabeth, at that point, was 17. And Sam and Henry, younger, everybody tried to earn money. Sam and Henry, being mid-early teens, were working in town, certainly had limited earning capacity, but Anna, Mary, and Elizabeth brought students into the house. They started teaching, bringing money in that way. And so you've got a situation in which not only are these siblings bound together, but in addition to that, the breadwinners, the ones on whom everyone are dependent, are women. And so the concept here with regard to how particularly the younger sons would view women, I think may have been altered by this, and how the women themselves viewed themselves may have been altered by this. So a lot of interesting things going on here. As I mentioned, Sam married Antoinette Brown, the first minister, ordained minister in the United States. Henry married suffragist Lucy Stone, and George married Lucy Stone's cousin. So they were really connected to a breed of women who were very much in their times or ahead of their times. Now, that being said, if we look at the people that Elizabeth in her book refers to, the thought leaders that she interacted with, it's really who's who in the 19th century. It's amazing to me that whenever she was in a town, in these large towns, she managed to find the people who were movers and shakers. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Times, William Lloyd Garrison, abolitionist of national repute, Harriet Beecher Stowe, mentioned in the video, and again, very powerful. They were, as I mentioned earlier, neighbors of the Beechers and the Stowes in Cincinnati, and closely intertwined. Around 1850 or so, when she visited England, she met Florence Nightingale, even before Florence Nightingale had achieved the acclaim that she later did, and became interested in and converted to the concept of the importance of hygiene in health, and she would carry this forward. She and Florence Nightingale, both strong, opinionated women, didn't agree on everything. Florence Nightingale thought the role of women was to be a nurse, and obviously Elizabeth Blackwell had a different idea there. But they got along. They formed a long-standing relationship. I put J. Marion Sims in here just because there's an interesting little dance that took place with him. If you don't know who he is a physician who practiced down south in Georgia had what amounted to a camp. He was practicing medicine and later evolved to have a camp that had on it slaves that had experienced a vesico-vaginal fistula, a hole between the bladder and vagina, and they were, as a result, outcasts. They had chronic infections, and he was trying to solve the problem. And the issue was that if you take this hole and just put a stitch in it, it breaks down. And so he repeatedly operated on these women, eventually developing an operation using silver sutures that was able to provide a lasting support and was a breakthrough at the time. Now, he was a person who was not without ambition and moved to New York and was trying to establish himself there when he and Elizabeth Blackwell came to know each other. And she assessed him as intelligent. She assessed him as someone who might be of assistance to her. And he had respect for her. They shared a lot of ideas. But at some point, he sized up the situation and saw the opportunities to open his own hospital and to essentially have a male staff as being more likely to make him successful. So he did that and kind of left her on the outside. She certainly knew what was going on, was not thrilled with it at all, but was still objective enough so that when she opened her own infirmary and Emily and Maria Zakshevska were doing surgeries, she made sure to include his operation as part of their portfolio because she knew it was a good operation. Now, if we look at, in general, her personality, intelligence, it goes without saying, but she was extraordinarily smart and meticulous. But also, it takes more than that to do what she did. And the idea that she had a lot of curiosity, that she was good at critical thinking, were really important parts to her personality and her character. She knew that in a man's world, if she was to break into this, she had to meet the highest traditional standards. She wasn't going to set her own standards, and she did. But she maintained a healthy skepticism regarding traditional methods. She looked at it rather coolly to try to determine whether things worked or didn't, and she didn't hesitate to look at other things as well. In fact, she traveled to get a water cure when her eye was injured to see if that would make a difference at all. She attended seminars on mesmerism and the like. And again, her assessment was pretty cool, but she was nonetheless positioning herself to be in a position to pick and choose and then further to develop even more. She vowed basically to use her infirmary to do experiments to find out what works, to measure her results, and then to incorporate that. Once she was in a position where she could make decisions, she wanted to be able to do what was proven, not what was traditional. And that was another very strong characteristic with regard to her. Now, with regard to the personality here, I think that there are a number of things that, in my opinion, probably helped her to achieve what she achieved, and also hindered her in some ways from leading a life that may have turned out a little less unhappy at some points. She wanted a non-traditional life. The quote from her was that I felt more determined than ever to become a physician, even though she had no background or fondness for medicine, and thus place a strong barrier between me and an ordinary marriage. I must have something to engross my thoughts, some object in life which will fill the vacuum and prevent this sad wearing away of the heart. So she intentionally was not only looking for a breakthrough for women, but a non-traditional life for herself in which she could satisfy herself that she was achieving something important. She was painfully frank. There are things that you think and you don't say. There are things that you say and you don't write down. And this, Elizabeth Blackwell had things that she not only wrote down, but when it came time for her to write her autobiography, thought, well, I think I'll include this in there as well. I didn't mention this in the video, but shortly after the three sisters started teaching in the home, she got a job in Kentucky and traveled to Kentucky, a slave state, to teach there. And she was teaching the children of slaveholders and also attempted to teach slaves as well, although circumstances were preventing her from doing that. But in the mix, she sort of makes some remarks about just her impressions regarding blacks, regarding her comfort level with being with them and the like, things which were extraordinarily crude. And yet, as I say, she included them in her autobiography. She had an opportunity to meet Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Gets an opportunity with the President of the United States and writes down in her correspondence, he's a tall, ungainly, loose-jointed man, much uglier than any photos I've seen, but his brain must be better in quality than quantity because his head's really small. So, here she is with an audience with the president, and that's kind of what she puts pen to ink for. And later, I'd mentioned that in the 1850s, there was a suffrage convention in Worcester. They repeatedly tried to loop her in to highlight her achievements and to gain her support. And so they would be very flattering to her when they would ask her to join them. And one of her responses was, "Women are feeble, narrow, frivolous at present, and ignorant of their own capacities, and undeveloped in thought and feeling," and therefore declared that she did not want to associate herself with that. So, as I say, this sort of way of reacting to people may have been an issue. She was resilient, incredibly so. There was an instance in Philadelphia where she was applying for admission to one of the medical schools, and she got this, it seems, endless response from the professor there, just going on page after page, waxing and waning about what a difficult decision it was, and pros and cons, and this might happen and that, on and on and on, page after page. Finally says, "No, we're not going to admit you." And her response to that was, "Well, at least he took me seriously, and maybe he'll be a friend going forward." So incredible resilience. When she was at the maternity, she was there because the medical establishment in France wouldn't recognize her as a physician, wouldn't loop her in to the hospitals and learning with the other physicians. She was there with the midwives. And as a result of that, while she's irrigating the eye of a baby with an infection, water splashes into her eye. She gets an infection. It ends her potential for being a surgeon. It results in months of her in pain and being treated and the like. She ends up having her eye removed and wore a glass eye for the rest of her life. So just a devastating thing. And writing a letter to her uncle at that time, "In truth, the accident might have been so much worse that I'm more disposed to rejoice than to complain." So real character there from the point of view of resilience and just going on. She was dispassionate, as I mentioned earlier. She could assess these different treatments that were out there and make what today we would feel is a very accurate assessment. She's not drawn along by the crowd in any way, and she's certainly not seeking the approval of others when she's making judgments regarding that. She's also the same regarding people. She would essentially size people up and try to decide whether they could help or not. She, recruited Emily, her younger sister, early on because her assessment was that Emily was smart enough, determined enough, but also was someone who she could control. And Maria Zakshevska, again, she sized her up, assured that she would go to medical school and come back and help them, and in fact turned out to be a remarkable physician. But she and her sister were always so determined. They were never happy. They were always pushing for more. And Maria Zakrzewska is quoted at one point as saying, these two women have a right to be satisfied. They've accomplished so much, but they won't acknowledge it. And so this sort of colors the ability to work with them and to move forward. In fact, Maria Zakrzewska, after the first several years of working with them, actually moved away. In the long run, this was a very good thing, but one wonders whether it was this brewing negativism that could have helped. Maria, just by way of a little aside, traveled up to Boston, became associated with the New England Medical College for Women, which is now Boston University, and then sort of reproducing the model that Elizabeth and Emily did in New York City, she opened up the hospital for indigent women and children in Boston. And in fact, to this day, that survives as the Demick Center. And on the campus is a Zakrzewska building. So it's just an interesting little aside. So as a result of her leaving, actually the movement that Elizabeth Blackwell was starting spread a little bit more. So that was a good thing. She was incredibly competitive, and to the point where, I mentioned that Emily was the third physician. In fact, Nancy Talbot was the second physician, and she graduated from the Cleveland Medical College. She moved to Boston, and when she heard that Emily was going to graduate, she traveled back to Cleveland to be in the audience and to congratulate Emily in person. Shortly afterwards, Emily wanted to travel to Europe and further her education. Nancy Talbot also wanted to do that and said, could we work together? Could we go as a pair? The Blackwell sisters kind of said, well, I don't think we got anything to gain by doing that, and essentially went their own way. Nancy Talbot nonetheless went to England. She did train there. In fact, came back, got married, and became Nancy Talbot Clark, and went to Boston. And there's a whole interesting story about that as well. But the Blackwells, Elizabeth Blackwell, never called her Dr. Clark or the like. They would refer to her as that little Mrs. Clark, and always felt that she wasn't quite up to their standard. And I mentioned in the video Doctors Garrett and Jex Blake and Putnam, people who were essentially disciples of Elizabeth Blackwell, who went back to England and opened up the medical profession to women, started a hospital, essentially in many ways reproduced what Elizabeth did. Years later, Elizabeth wanted to go to England and do all those things and be recognized as the breakthrough, the leader. But these women had essentially moved forward, inspired by her, but without her. And as a result of this and Elizabeth's hurt feelings, she said, they are all hard, mannish, soulless. As women physicians, I think them not only useless, but objectionable. So these were people who were her disciples, but who she did not rise to the level that she wanted to, and became rather bitter. She was very transactional in her relationships with others. She had some close relationships that appeared to be a bonding, but most of the time it was very transactional. And she maintained close relationships with her siblings, but early on, once she returns from Kentucky, so within several years of beginning to pitch in and to contribute to the family support, she changes her mind essentially and decides to go into medicine. And at that point, the flow starts to go more in her direction. She is providing little support to the family. The family, in fact, is providing some support to her with her moves and providing her certainly with emotional support throughout her life. So she emerges as kind of the Alpha Blackwell, and becomes essentially a leader as opposed to a contributor, even at the level of her family. So that's kind of what we have there. And then there is an episode, a chapter in her life that I just couldn't put in the video. And this has to do with the fact that in 1854, prior to Emily coming home, Elizabeth is lonely, she's struggling, she needs company, and she decides to adopt Kitty Barry, a 7-year-old Irish orphan who in 1854 comes to live with her. And the relationship really is not one of mother and daughter or child. Although she referred to Kitty even into adulthood as child, Kitty always referred to her as my doctor. And Elizabeth used her as a companion, as an assistant, but not so much intending to raise her to go out into the world and become independent on her own. Kitty never complained and essentially was always grateful for the company and the opportunity to help my doctor, but a very different relationship, never even gave her the Blackwell name. And there's a episode in the Doctor's Blackwell book in which around 1858 or so, Elizabeth is traveling to England and Europe to do some networking and size things up. And she is, at one point, is in Paris. She did not want to take Kitty with her and left her with some relatives who then put her onto a boarding school where she was not being treated well. Eventually, Kitty got word to Elizabeth about what was happening to her, and Elizabeth sent for her. And what follows is how Elizabeth got her to Paris. Essentially, the caretakers took Kitty to a train and put her on the train. And she's maybe 10 years old, 11 at this time. Put her on a train, and that goes to the coast. She then gets on a ferry, goes over to France. At the coast there, she gets onto a train, goes into Paris, and arrives at about midnight. And there is no one there to meet her. And the people are taken aback a bit at the train station. All she's got is a passport and an address on a piece of paper. And they put her on a carriage and try to send her on her way. Meanwhile, Elizabeth is arriving late. She essentially gets in there and finds out what's happened and sets out and eventually encounters the carriage carrying Kitty and takes her and brings her to her apartment. Kitty, of course, is no worse for the wear. She, again, is not complaining. But it paints a picture of what was happening with her at this time. When the family was together, Elizabeth would essentially have Kitty serve the cousin. She was less a peer than she was an aide in those days. And even in later life, she continued to serve Elizabeth, as you see in this photo here. Elizabeth Blackwell died in 1910, living in England, and per her wishes was buried in Scotland. Kitty continued to live in their home in England for a while, then moved up to Scotland to be in the same town as Elizabeth's remains, eventually uniting with the Blackwells, and in fact, after Elizabeth passed away, changing her last name to Blackwell. She lived into the early 1930s and always felt that she was grateful for being with Elizabeth Blackwell. So, this paints, again, a picture that may not look great on the evening news. So, looking back, I mean, we've got these various things that I mentioned in the past two slides, but let's look at this incredible work she did. She couldn't get into a dispensary, she started a dispensary. She couldn't get into an infirmary, she started an infirmary. And she upped the game each time, applying those critical thinking skills and that intelligence that she had to actually improve care. She established a medical school, but beyond that, medical schools at that time were basically 2 years in which maybe a 3 or 4 month school year was repeated twice, and then you were given oral exams and a certificate. and sent on your way. And in those days, there were no licensing boards. Here in Massachusetts, for example, the Board of Registration in Medicine was not established until 1894. And prior to that, whatever credentialing was done by the medical societies. What she did was she not only started a school for women, had admission criteria that were a little more stringent. She extended the duration to 3 years from 2. And they were a progressive curriculum, not repeated each year. It was connected to the infirmary so that students would see patients and get clinical experience. And graduation exams were from outside experts, so no one could imply that it was they were being passed just to extract their tuition money from them. So these were all revolutionary ideas in 1868. I mentioned that around that same time, the dean of Harvard Medical School wanted to up the game there and changed it to a stricter written exam policy and the like, was warned that given the difficulty with some of the students in reading and writing, it would cost him some tuition. And in fact, when he implemented this in the early 1870s, the enrollment dropped about 40% or so. Johns Hopkins, which was the model we follow to this day with pre-registration, a prerequisite rather of a bachelor's degree, 2 years of clinical, 2 years of basic science and 2 years of clinical with a connected hospital. That model didn't start until 1892. So her coming up with the ideas she did was I think, incredibly remarkable. The issue of blending hygiene with healthcare and prevention was something which she did seamlessly. She brought Ruth Cole into the practice, the second black physician in the country, and established home visits for mothers so that they could learn how to take better care of their children and have children that survived and were healthier. Again, thinking out of the box and doing an incredible job. She had no fondness for clinical work. Remarked even in her autobiography that people, getting warm with her, touching her, the like, made her very uncomfortable. And so as a result, I think her bonding with Emily, who was much more a traditional physician in that sort of way, was a very smart move. Ditto with Maria Zakrzewska. Her later work in England, despite her bitter remarks, she did work with those doctors at the medical school, did work in women's health at that time, women's care, and was active in England with regard to legislation and the like. So she never gave up. But these are the complexities of this individual. So I guess what we need to say here is, what do we make of all of this? I hope you now know a lot more about Elizabeth Blackwell and all that she achieved, just an incredible amount. She had certain flaws with regard to her personality that may have enabled her to accomplish as much as she did, rowing against the current and basically having to deal with setbacks one after the other. But these characteristics may have expressed themselves in other ways as well, which in some ways may have made life a little more difficult for her or those who dealt with her. So I don't know what we make of her today, but I know that we're at a point in time where if there are negatives, very often they overwhelm positives. And I wonder whether, as we look at people today, whether there's room for us to rethink that approach that so often happens, and that we consider things a little bit differently. So that's my talk on Elizabeth Blackwell, and I would be happy to hear from you regarding your impressions regarding Elizabeth Blackwell. and also answer any questions you might have. With regard to further resources, I mentioned my video, I mentioned the doctor's Blackwell, the fact that her autobiography is available actually free online. And in addition, a colleague of mine in Worcester, Lynn Eckert, has gotten into it a lot more than I have, and actually traveled to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe and gotten her hands on various papers and and wrote a one-woman play, which was recorded and is accessible if you join the Woman in Medicine Legacy Foundation. It's not freely available. They don't charge you, but you need to join to watch it. But it's a different take on Elizabeth Blackwell than I've got, and maybe of interest to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dale. You've given us a tremendous amount of very rich store of information about Dr. Blackwell and her environment, which is very helpful. We have implications for this, but let me ask just for an overview. On the whole, what do you think the attitude toward Blackwell was from the medical profession of her time, and what influence do you think she had on the medical profession?
Mm-hmm. Good points. I would say that medicine, particularly early on, was a heavily driven by tradition, and you did not have people who were thinking too far out of the box. People would accept her. They would. She repeatedly heard from people as she was approaching the medical profession and trying to get an education that people understood. They thought she could do it. They knew she was intelligent, and her well, but did not want to be the ones who took responsibility for actually advocating for her. She did find some people who did advocate for her. She did find some people who helped her along, and so it was a mixed bag. There were those who would not accept a woman and just it was out of the question in practicing medicine, and there were those who had a great deal of respect for her intelligence and also for the principle of accepting women. So there was that duality there. With regard to respecting the medicine she practiced, I think that the medicine she practiced was equal to or better than anything that was being offered at the time. Still, we were in a situation where she opened these infirmaries for the poor because the trade was coming to her. The women who had the means preferred to go to men. And so she made the best of that situation, but in her time there was that issue. And I think that there were other instances in which we weren't so much dealing with is she a woman or not, but how easy she might be to work with, in that there was another episode during the Civil War where they were building a medical corps up. And that is, in fact, how she ended up meeting Abraham Lincoln. But even though she knew more than anyone there, it went to Dorothea Dix. And she was bitter about that. She did her work. Her and her sister took time off. They delivered care to the troops. And standards of care, but when they felt they'd done a reasonable amount, they retreated somewhat bitterly because they were not leaders. So there's this edginess to the whole thing that affects her ability to get things done.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot going on, like I say, and as I say, I thought it would be interesting, particularly in a colloquium that has psychiatry in its title, to just toy with the pros and cons of her personality and her character and the like, and see, at least give you a chance to reflect on it and see if there are any other thoughts.
Well, I guess the lesson is that people's accomplishments are and careers are influenced so much by the response and the interaction with their environments, regardless of what they have to offer. What is done with it, how much it is recognized, it depends so much on how they interact with the people who are listening, who are going to be responding.
We
Well,
do have a question from Susan Carr, and she's asking, any comments about her psychologically rather than just her personality?
So we've got a psychiatrist on the screen here. I'm not sure a retired gynecologist would be your best choice.
well, certainly there are a lot of hints about it. We don't know. A psychiatrist interested in psychodynamics goes back to the beginning. What were the early influences that then created the later person? And we don't know a lot about her parents, her relationship with her parents and with her siblings. But certainly there are hints that she is uncomfortable with emotional contact, with emotional relationship. And she is much more involved in principle and in intellectual aspects. And that's what makes her so creative in that sphere, but also makes her awkward and um, standoffish about relating to people. She does know who's important. She does make contact with them. She does, in the way, do business with them, as you said, transactional relationship. But she's not doesn't have loving, long-term, warm friendships and and support from disciples and that kind of emotionally laden relationship. So it's the life of an intellectual amongst a society that runs a lot on emotions that sets her apart. And it's a shame that she doesn't get more recognition than she does. It's good of you to remind her, to inform us about her, but there's no seminal textbook that she wrote, or school that's named after her, or society in her in her honor. It is somebody who made her way, and it's lucky that she was as plucky and determined as she was, that she could survive all of this and not be ground down by it.
Yeah. She basically mentions that growing up, I mean, here she is, she's put in the position of supporting the family early on in her teens. And she looks, I'm sure she would look at the agony her mother must have been in, having 9 children and no source of support. She looks at her own capacity and what she can do. And she's in these turbulent times where a lot of things are being questioned. She mentions in more than one instance that you're either emotional or you're objective and you're going to get things done the way she got things done. And she said there's no room for emotion in what I do. I have to steel myself. But so it sounds like she isn't naturally as cool as she comes across, but rather someone who's made the determination that she needs to kind of repress that or whatever and move forward and steel herself.
She can, as people do, blame the world for the way they turn out. And this is what is required of her. But this is in important ways. This is how she sees the world, and that's how she relates to the world, and that's what makes it turn out that way. But it's you hope that the things that she accomplished intellectually and professionally made good use of her talents and her capacity, and didn't get lost because of this cool relationship that she had. I wonder if the question
Mhm.
has any ideas about what what's going on with her psychologically.
Oh, Susan says no.
Well,
Okay.
Susan has an interest, but she hasn't developed it into an opinion. Diana, any thoughts on your part?
Well, I think that it's she is pretty amazing, and to do what she did at that time in history. And Dr. Magee, your point about kind of the right person at the right time
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense because, um, yeah, just from the start of her decision to become a doctor when she had no interest in it at the beginning, she she is caring for people and caring for women to bring women up in the field. And so that I would say is an element of it's not like emotional, but it's something, it's a type of connectivity that she feels with other people. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, she's just astounding. And I appreciate your bringing her up and letting us know about her.
There's a movie there someplace. I, I couldn't help but think that as I was reading her autobiography. But thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you. Many thanks for a lively introduction to a life carved out amidst the customs and prejudices of American medicine. It reminds us that medicine is a social institution that incorporates all the philosophy and prejudices of its parent society, and Dr. Blackwell's experience suggests the opportunities for acceptance and independence of the milieu in which we find ourselves.